Hi there. I've heard something a number of times recently in my role as educator in residence at the Trico Charitable Foundation, as a teacher in the social innovation space, let's say, and in my efforts with a partner to start a new social business. And what I've heard is how a lot of people have found it challenging in our community to use a for-profit business structure to do good. The people who are trying to do that are struggling to convince people that the social focus of what they're doing is authentic. Often those people can't raise the money they need to, or at least at first. They have a real convincing job to do because they're met with skepticism. And it's easy to dismiss this as, people in the community viewing them as a for-profit, so that they're, taking a profit and doing good are at odds with each other. And maybe that's true. On one hand, although I'd also say that there might be something more to it than this. In addition, I've heard it's strongly argued by people in our community that organizations practicing corporate social responsibility are doing incredible good in the world. Even big oil and gas or tech companies are doing incredible good in the world. And that makes sense to me too. Seems reasonable. But I do ask, is there something more to this? Is there something, another way to think about these kind of things, which is where I want to go with this today. I want to try and dig a bit deeper than the way we normally think about things. And this is the way we normally think about things. It's the so-called continuum model. There are a lot of really good examples that I'll point you to in the blog that goes with this video. But basically this is a division of, or categorization or classification of different organizational types into charity, nonprofit, social enterprise, social business, corporate social responsibility, and for-profit. And you'll see different labels on there. I've sort of simplified things here, but the idea is that we tend to, or we're presented with, if we talk about these things, this sort of categorization. The layperson may just think of charities and nonprofits in a big group versus for-profits. They may not even articulate that to themselves. But nevertheless, that's the case. And this is a classification by mission. I'd like to ask us to think a little bit more deeply about this. Is that too simplistic? And what I've put on the screen here is a sort of 2x2, where on one hand we're looking at creation of value, and on the other hand we're looking at capture of value. And the notion that it might be a curve instead of a continuum. That for a fixed set of resources, you can only do so much in terms of capturing and creating. To do one, you have to give up on the other. And so you end up on this curve that I'm showing here. To give a little bit more of an understanding of what I mean here, if you were an organization that lands where that orange dot is, you'd be maximizing value creation. Your focus, your emphasis, your mission, your objectives would be around maximizing value creation. If you landed here, you'd be doing pretty well on the value maximization. It wouldn't be quite as high, but you'd be halfway, or I've written here suffice or sufficient on value capture. On the other hand, if you were over here, you'd be sufficient on value creation and much more focused on value capture. And then finally over here, you'd be maximizing value capture. You would be in the game for capturing value, and you wouldn't be too worried about creating value. And I'll give you some examples of all these in a minute. And I think it's interesting to use this kind of way of thinking to complement what we normally do with the continuum that I showed you a few minutes ago. So here is that continuum again. You can see all the elements there from charity through to for-profit. And I'm going to place them on this chart here. So you can see a nonprofit or a charity is focused on creating value. They're not there to capture value. Nobody walks away with a piece of that value other than the population that they're trying to serve. So they're there right at the top left, which is maximizing value creation and really minimizing, not worrying, ignoring value capture. Over here is the other end of that traditional continuum. It's the for-profit venture that aims to do what they can on value creation. And don't get me wrong, all those are geared at, you ask any person in a nonprofit, or a for-profit, sorry, they're focused on value creation. but they're really there to capture value for shareholders, for employees, for executives, and so on. So I place them there. And I ask you to take this with a grain of salt. It's an idea, and see where we go with it. Next, I would place the other two that relate to those. A social enterprise is not that different from a nonprofit. In fact, defined at least as it's done often here in Western Canada with the definitions we use, a social enterprise is a nonprofit organization that seeks to create value and earn revenue through its value creation activities. But I would propose it lands somewhere not far from the traditional nonprofit and charity position. It's an effort to move over into value capture a bit, to earn some income that they wouldn't otherwise earn, but that's what it looks like. And as I've shown here on sort of the right side, corporate social responsibility is in an effort by for-profit organizations to do more on the value creation side. But in both cases, they start at those orange dots, those anchor positions, and try to move to their respective positions. And I'm going to ask you to go with me that that's where they move to, that it's not a big movement. Next, we'll place social business, and by social business, I mean the true Muhammad Yunus style social business as he proposes it, for the sake of discussion. There's a lot of language and definitions you could use here. I'm going to just clarify what I mean for the sake of this discussion. So this is a no dividend, no loss, social business focused on the mission. Any surplus that's created is driven back into, you may call it profit, or if it's surplus, it's driven back into the operations of the business. It's there to create value. And value capture is done through that mechanism of bringing it back in order to make things happen for serving that mission. So that's kind of how I would place the spectrum on this new value creation to value capture curve. I'm going to clean it up a little bit here, sort of take some of those away that are variants on the main pivot or anchor points. And I'll also place over here a criminal gang. A criminal gang is actually the other end of the continuum. We don't normally write that. But in this notion, this idea that I'm putting out here, it aims to capture value. A gang doesn't care about what it creates. A criminal gang, it goes out to capture value for itself at all costs. It's not there to create any value. So in this sense, it's really interesting that social business and for-profit businesses are at the center, or at the middle. They represent the middle of a continuum, rather than we normally think of for-profit at the far right side. And in fact, it's not. It's more of a blend, if you will. So I'm going to label these SB and FP for social business and for-profit, just to kind of relate to that blended value that we often do in the traditional continuum. So go with me and think of everybody upper left of social business as a creator, and everybody lower right of a for-profit as a capturer. And then in the middle we might have a blended area. So that's not all that different from blended value, although it's a little shifted from what we normally do in the traditional continuum. And I wanted to highlight to you, just although these look quite similar in placement, they're quite, they're along the middle of that curve, they are very, very different. The orange line I've drawn at the top there by social business shows, if you do the math, the basic trigonometry here, it's 86.6% of the way up to maximizing value creation. Whereas the for-profit is actually 86.6% of the way towards capturing value rather than creating value. So these are close in some ways visually, but they're very far apart in what they try to do. And that makes some sense. A true Muhammad Yunus style social business is all about value creation. And a nominal or center of gravity kind of for-profit is all about value capture for its stakeholders. It has to create value in order to capture value, but it's about the value capture. So I'm trying to say that these are actually quite far apart. So let's go back to our traditional continuum. I'm going to modify it a little bit to make it, to draw the distinction, to draw some parallels between what I've just shown you and what we normally talk about. So the first thing I'll do is just remind you that this is the whole continuum. If you put it on the curve that I'm talking about, the value creation capture curve. that's, as I've said, constrained by everything on there is a certain given set of resources. So given a set of resources by the goals you set, by what you choose to optimize, you can land anywhere on that curve. And the orange ones are the anchor points. So you could be a nonprofit or charity that focuses on value creation. Far away from that, you could be a criminal gang that focuses on value capture. And the two anchor points in the middle that I've talked about are a social business and a for-profit business. Now, I'm going to in a minute show you what we can do by looking at this element, the distance from the bottom to the organizational type in question. So the amount of value creation focus that an organization has. So remember that orange arrow in a few minutes here. This is again our continuum. I'm going to draw the two variants, as I've called them. I mean no disrespect to anybody in those fields, but the two variants as yellow rather than orange. They're not strong anchor points for me. And then I'm going to shift things around to look a little like this, just to help me draw things. Nonprofit and charity land together. Social enterprise is a variant of it in the way I'm doing it here. Social business is another key anchor point. For-profit is another of the four key anchor points, with a variant of corporate social responsibility. And then on the far end, you've got a criminal gang. And I think this represents things in the way that I'm trying to do today. So I've shifted our continuum a bit to make a few points. I'm going to draw on that value creation to capture curve I've talked about. And I'm going to plot here, this is where that orange arrow comes in, the percentage of creating. And this isn't, this is a relative emphasis, a relative focus of these organizations. So here are the dots, and basic high school trigonometry will tell you that this is a sinusoid. And by the way, I don't know if the real world is sinusoid. I'm putting out a model that I hope complements the traditional model with some thinking. But nevertheless, if you adopt that model, you're willing to go with it for this conversation, it's a sinusoid. And I've got these values from the height of each of those locations on the earlier curve. You can go back and look at that basic trig. So I'm not doing anything fancy here. I'm not trying to pretend it's a rigorous deterministic system or that we know exactly what we're talking about. I'm just trying to get a rule of thumb out here, or basic understanding. So I've done that for each of those, and I get these dots. Now if you do it for every point along the curve, you're looking at a sinusoid like this. And then you can color code those and say, okay, now I've got a nice picture of creating and capturing what focus each of those has as you move along that continuum, as I've redrawn it here. So a nonprofit on the left is very focused on, 100% focused on creating. A criminal gang is 100% focused on capturing. What's interesting is everything in between is really a blend, or a dual focus, or some mix of focuses, a blended value of sorts, which I find interesting. It's not just social enterprise and social business that are blended value as we traditionally talk about. So that's interesting to me. Next, I sort of want to go back to that original question that I posed at the start of this video, that I'm seeing people, talking to people who are trying to use a for-profit organization to do social good, and running into that question of, is it authentic? People don't buy that that's an authentic way to do good. And it's interesting because I think intuitively, a lot of us have this notion that we now have on the screen in front of us, that a nonprofit or a charity is focused on creating value for some organization. Now, given a set of resources, so given my organizational resources, what I can pull together to make things happen, to make change happen, to do good for people, on the for-profit is in the way we understand it, is necessarily much more focused on capturing. There is a good focus on creating, but it's focused on capturing. Now this is interesting. I mean, give this some thought, take it as you will, but it kind of makes sense. On that side of for-profit, we often get read criticisms of for-profit organizations that their CEOs are being compensated much more than they should be for what they are doing. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. I mean, a CEO worth, many millions of dollars worth might be worth many hundreds of times the average employee in salary. I don't know, but the argument has been made many times that there is much more capturing going on than creating, or that the value being created isn't at the same level as what's being compensated or captured. So I'll leave you with that thought. But this is sort of trying to put some meat and potatoes behind that intuitive response that people give when people in a for-profit organization are trying to do social good, or that we're trying to do social good by organizing as a for-profit. Another interesting point on this is how small the variation is if you've bought what I've said when you go from non-profit and charity to social enterprise, or when you go from for-profit to corporate social responsibility. It doesn't really change the position much in terms of these variables I put on the screen, which kind of makes sense with our intuition again. And then I thought I'd leave you with some thoughts about the social business, because it's really interesting to me that a social business, if you look at it this way, is in the middle of the continuum, or to the right of the continuum, as that traditional continuum draws it. In fact, it's over here on the left. And the focus is I've drawn these as a cartoon here, but it's 86.6% on creating value. Capturing as an objective is nowhere near as high as the for-profit situation. In fact, one's the yin to the other's yang. They really are opposites around the center here. So I find that interesting. But I'll put a stake in the ground here, my own opinion is the power of the social business comes, is that the line I've just drawn on the screen there is everything to the right of that is organized sort of corporate structure, legal structure, in a for-profit sense. A social business is a for-profit organization that aims to do good without, no loss, no dividend kind of organization. True Muhammad Yunus style in the sense that I'm meaning it here. So it's got the potential to tap into the market, to have all those market efficiencies, to hire people at the value they're worth, not more than they're worth, potentially, as in the for-profit case, but at the value they're worth, for the value they create. But it's also got its focus on creating, which is fundamentally different. So I put, as I said, a stake in the ground that, if we can get over the inertia of our global social business systems that make, want to see things, want to resist change, let's say, the social business offers a really powerful alternative for creating value. So I'll summarize, on the traditional view of the world, we have charities, nonprofits, social enterprises, social business, corporate social responsibility, and for-profits on this continuum, from social mission, focus on the left, to, and it's not a left-right thing like political spectra, but and financial mission on the right. And in the middle, we typically talk about blended value. That social enterprise and social business are focused on doing both social good and financial good at the same time. I would ask you to think about things differently, and I'd love your thoughts on this. That maybe we could look at things in terms of value creation and value capture in terms of objectives of those organizations. And that the continuum starts to look like this instead. We've got the anchor points being nonprofits and charities, social business, for-profit, and criminal gain, which means that for-profit isn't on one end of the continuum. It's actually, a blend, a mix of objectives, as we've talked about. Now, the way I've asked you to think about it, social enterprise is a variant of a nonprofit, for example. And corporate social responsibility is a variant of a for-profit, neither moving too far from those anchor points, those traditional anchor points that we think about. And then I'll share with you this last piece, which is a summary of what I've tried to get across, that perhaps that continuum looks different, and that it might be a useful way to look at things if we look at, going back to this picture, the focus or emphasis of each on creating and capturing. And coupled with that, I made some comments about the attractiveness of a social business, because it is of a for-profit nature. It can tap into the market without violating any rules or laws or norms, but its focus is overwhelmingly on creation at the same time. So I leave you with those thoughts and welcome your feedback. This is just an early noodling on some ideas that I've had, some challenges that I've had with the traditional way of looking at things, and the hope that it does sort of explain that, those things that we've seen out there, that a traditional for-profit structure is met with some skepticism when it's trying to do good. And that, yes, a corporate social responsibility approach in a really big company can have some real good, because they're operating in such scope. And I need to clarify before closing that I don't mean to say in this isn't a picture of the value created versus value captured. It's a relative thing. So a very large $10 billion for-profit company operating with CSR, it's 14% focus on creating value and leaving that on the table for people, could be much, much bigger than a nonprofit that is, I don't know, pick a number, $500,000 a year organization. So the argument could be made, and could be quite strong, that CSR is powerful and important and needed. What I'm trying to say is, if you normalize things to a given set of resources, a given capitalization, a given size of organization of our operations, then you're looking at this sort of relative thing that helps explain some of the things that we've been talking about. So thanks very much. I really would appreciate any feedback you might have.